Somewhere in the South China Sea, on a submerged reef the Philippines calls Ayungin Shoal, there is a ship that shouldn't still be floating. It has no engine and its hull is more rust than steel. A dozen of Filipino Marines live inside it, rationing food and drinking water shipped in by boat because the ship can't move, and that's exactly the point. The international community calls it the most contested piece of scrap metal on Earth. China has demanded it be towed away, but the Philippines has vowed it will never leave. Warships, water cannons, and international tribunals have all clashed over this single, dying vessel. But before it became a flashpoint between two nations, before it became a symbol, it was something else entirely. It stormed beaches in World War II and battled river ambushes in Vietnam. It carried the desperate remnants of a collapsing country's navy to safety. By the end of this video, you'll understand where this ship actually came from, the wars it survived long before anyone in Manila or Beijing cared about it, the real reason the Philippines deliberately grounded it in 1999, and why this single rusting hull has become one of the most contested locations in the entire South China Sea today. This is the untold story of the BRP Sierra Madre, and how a warship built to fight wars ended up in the most contested water in the South China Sea. The story doesn't begin in the Philippines nor in Asia. It begins in Evansville, Indiana, in the autumn of 1944, at a shipyard called Missouri Valley Bridge and Iron Company. The ship was laid down on September 19, 1944, launched a month later on the 27th of October, and commissioned into the United States Navy on the 14th of November 1944, in the middle of the largest naval war in human history. She was built as a landing ship tank. These weren't glamorous warships. They were blunt, boxy vessels with one brutal job: run straight up onto an enemy beach, open the bow doors, and unload tanks and troops directly into a war zone. LSTs were nicknamed large slow targets by the men who crewed them, because that's exactly what they were. Slow, thin-skinned, and always first into the fire. This particular ship was simply known as LST-821. She earned one battle star for her service in the Pacific during World War II. When the war ended, so did her story. She was decommissioned in March 1946 and placed into what the Navy called the Reserve Fleet, or essentially a graveyard for ships nobody needed anymore. For nearly a decade, she sat idle. Then, in 1955, something small happened that would define her identity for the next 70 years. The Navy renamed her and became the USS Harnett County, named after a county in North Carolina, and that she would carry the name into the next war nobody saw coming. She thought her fighting days were over. She had no idea the deadliest chapter of her life hadn't even started. By the mid-1960s, the United States was pouring men and machines into Vietnam. Vietnam was made up not just of lands and mountains, but also rivers. That's why the war wasn't just being fought on jungle trails. It was also being fought on rivers. The Mekong Delta is a maze of waterways controlled by Viet Cong ambushes. This made the US Navy to come up with the idea of a mobile base that could float inside enemy territory. The Harnett County was pulled out of reserve and reactivated for exactly this purpose. She's one of just 4 LSTs refitted as floating bases for what became known as the Mobile Riverine Force under Operation Game Warden. This wasn't the ship that stormed Pacific beaches anymore. Engineers transformed her into something closer to a floating aircraft carrier for helicopters and river patrol boats, as well as a forward operating base sitting in the middle of hostile waterways. One of her jobs was resupplying and repairing the small craft that hunted Viet Cong along the rivers. And it worked, better than almost anyone expected. Over years of combat, the ship and her crew endured ambushes, rocket attacks, and the constant threat of mines drifting downriver. And they didn't just survive it. The Harnett County earned 9 battle stars for Vietnam service, along with 2 Presidential Unit citations and 3 Navy Unit commendations, which is one of the most decorated ships of her class in that war. This was the ship's finest hour. American involvement in Vietnam was ending, and in October 1970, under a program to hand equipment to South Vietnamese forces, the ship was formally transferred to South Vietnam's Navy and renamed the RVNS Mai To. She would fight on under a different flag, for a country that had only a few years left to exist. In 5 years, that country would collapse completely, and this ship would carry the survivors of its final hours out to sea. April 1975. Saigon was falling. The South Vietnamese government that this ship had served for 5 years was collapsing in real time, and its navy faced an impossible choice: stay and be captured or run. The ship, now the Mai Tho, was one of roughly 35 vessels of the South Vietnamese Navy that made the desperate voyage across the South China Sea to the Philippines, carrying refugees and personnel away from a country that no longer existed by the time they arrived. She traveled into Subic Bay, battle-worn, overcrowded, flying the flag of a nation that had ceased to exist. It was the end of one identity, but not the end of her story. A year later, in April 1976, the ship was formally transferred once more, and this time to the Philippine Navy. They gave her a new name, one drawn from a mountain range: BRP Sierra Madre. By now she was over 30 years old, a World War II built hull that had already fought two wars for two different navies. Most ships her age were being scrapped. Instead, she was about to be handed the strangest assignment of her entire career. For the next 20 years, she would serve quietly. Then, one decision, made in secret, denied in public, would turn her into the most talked about ship in the Pacific. To understand why the Sierra Madre ended up where she is now, you have to understand what happened 4 years earlier, in 1995, an event that terrified Filipino military planners. China moved to take control of Mischief Reef, a reef inside the Philippines' own exclusive economic zone in the disputed Spratly Islands. What was quietly built there as, supposedly, shelter for fishermen was later found to have real military infrastructure. The Philippines had lost territory it believed was legally its own, without firing a shot, without even being able to stop it. Manila couldn't match China's navy ship for ship, so it needed a different kind of weapon, not firepower, but presence, a physical undeniable fact on the ground that international law could point to. In 1999, under President Joseph Estrada, the Philippine military was ordered to run the Sierra Madre aground on a shoal called Second Thomas Shoal, known in the Philippines as Ayungin Shoal. Officially at the time, it was framed as mechanical trouble, an old ship that simply broke down. One of the officials involved later admitted publicly that the cover story was that it was an accident, but politicians knew otherwise. It was not an accident. It was a strategy, and a blunt one. Run an old warship onto a reef, station troops aboard, and dare anyone to remove a commissioned vessel of a sovereign navy. It worked exactly as intended, and arguably too well. The Sierra Madre could never sail again. She had become something new. Not a ship, but a fixed position, permanent, immovable, and impossible to quietly dismiss. Almost immediately, the plan showed its teeth. Only days after she ran aground, Chinese frigates reportedly arrived and trained their guns on the stranded ship, though ultimately withdrew without incident. It was the first sign that this rusting hulk would not be ignored. It would be contested for decades to come. What began as a Cold War era leftover, grounded almost as an afterthought, became the single most dangerous flashpoint in the South China Sea. And it still is today. More than 25 years later, the Sierra Madre is still there. A small detachment, typically less than a dozen Philippine Marines, lives aboard the rusting hulk, resupplied by boat because there is no other way in or out. Life aboard has been described by journalists who visited as harsh almost beyond belief. A ship one reporter called 2,000 tons of tetanus shots, rusted through in places, patched together with whatever the Marines can find, and the confrontations have only intensified. Chinese Coast Guard vessels routinely block, chase, and blast water cannons at Philippine boats trying to reach the ship. In 2023, two vessels collided during a resupply run. By June 2024, an incident near the shoal left Filipino sailors injured, one reportedly losing a finger, during a confrontation with Chinese personnel. China has formally demanded the Philippines tow the ship away entirely, calling its presence there illegal, and that is the strange, almost poetic irony at the heart of this story. A ship built to invade beaches in 1944. A ship that once symbolized American naval power in two wars is now valuable to the Philippines for the exact opposite reason. Not because of what it can do, because it cannot leave. Every rusted plate, every leaking hull seam is proof of a claim that refuses to disappear. The BRP Sierra Madre was never meant to be a monument. She was built to fight, refit to survive, and transferred from navy to navy as wars ended and nations changed. She has been an invasion craft, a river fortress, a refugee ship, and now, an 80-year-old wreck holding the line for a nation that has almost nothing else to hold it with. Nobody knows how much longer her hull can survive the sea. But as long as she's there, one message is being sent to the entire Pacific. Some claims aren't made with warships. Sometimes they're made by a ship that simply refuses to sink.